The human journey can be seen as a quest, a search for knowledge, a search for comfort, a search for understanding. Perhaps the greatest of humanity's questions have involved faith, have involved God. Beliefs about God have traveled a long road, one that has brought three great monotheist traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to understand God as they do today. It is an understanding that has changed over time and is indeed still changing.
At an early stage of their history, Jews, Christians and Muslims were all called atheists by their pagan contemporaries, not because they didn't believe in God, obviously they did, but because their notion of the sacred was so different.
The idea of one supreme God in the universe so dominates humanity's consciousness, it is almost taken for granted. But getting here has been a journey, unpredictable, difficult, and even painful. This is that story, a history of God.
I am what I am. Recite. This is my son. Listen, he is the one, my God. God shall have no other God. Called by all being.
Since the dawn of humanity, some 100,000 years ago, humans have sought to make sense of an unpredictable and often chaotic world. Who are we? Why are we? Why do the seasons change? Why is life filled with suffering? What happens when we die? This quest brought human beings to consider matters spiritual, matters beyond the material world. Early cultures looked to a host of supernatural powers, what we would call gods, for comfort and order. This belief in many gods, called polytheism or paganism, dominated humanity's sense of the divine for most of its history. Belief in a single, supreme, divine being, monotheism, began to appear a mere 4,000 years ago. While humanity today thinks of God as an eternal, unchanging presence, ideas about God have in fact been changing ever since God first appeared on the face of the earth.
The idea of God changing sounds a contradiction in terms, because God is supposed to be absolute and eternal and sacred. And in fact, that essential sacred reality doesn't change, but the way people express it over the years does change. We cannot be religious in the same way as our ancestors. Our perspective has entirely changed. We've looked at the world from outer space, for example. And so each generation has the task of looking back at its traditions, looking back at its scriptures, looking at its own peculiar and unique circumstances, and making a creative jump to apply the past tradition to the problems of the present.
God as a work in progress first began with the many gods of polytheism. Each god had limited domains of power and responsibility, such as the hunt, or war, fertility, or death. For early human beings, these many, although limited gods, felt very accessible and close at hand.
Pagans, or polytheists, people who believed in many gods, had a very inclusive, warm relationship with both the divine and the world. They didn't see a great gulf that yawned between the world and men and women and the gods. Paganism was attractive because the gods were so near, because you didn't have to struggle so hard to see them, and because they were felt to be immediate presences in your life.
If we want a sense of the attraction of polytheism, I think we should look at Catholicism with its saints. No Catholic would say she's a polytheist, but they do like to check in with saints who are useful for this or that. St. Rita of Cassia is the saint for desperate causes. So is St. Jude. I'm born on St. Agatha's Day. She had her breast cut off, and she's a patroness of women with breast cancer. Christopher was the saint for travelers. So that in a sense you have a shadow of that human impulse to say, I've got to check in and cover all bases. That's why there was polytheism.
And so it was that early humanity kept in touch with the divine through many gods, each of which could be contacted directly and for a specific purpose. And then, as far as we can tell, the first stirrings of movement toward the idea of one divine being occurred some 4,000 years ago. The place was the land of Canaan, at the western edge of the ancient Middle East. Its inhabitants were called Canaanites.
Canaanite was a typically polytheistic pagan religion. It had its own pantheon. The chief god was El, a rather shadowy figure, a high god. He had a son, Baal, the god of storm and fertility, and Baal's sister was Anat, the goddess of the harvest.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the traditional founders of Judaism, lived their lives surrounded by these gods. It would be out of this pagan culture that monotheism, the belief in one supreme God, would begin to emerge.
The patriarchs were not monotheists in our sense. They didn't believe in only one God. They may have selected only one God as the object of their devotion, but they believed that other gods existed. And Abraham behaved like a typical pagan. When he arrived in Canaan, he didn't bring his old gods with him because they weren't effective in that area anymore. He immediately started to worship the local god, El.
The monotheistic tradition naturally wants to look back at its founder or its founders as the revolutionary, almost whole and complete from day one. And yet, no one can grasp even a new idea without growing out of the existing ideas. So, at the least, one can say that El, the name by which Abraham calls God, by which Jacob and Isaac call God, is also a name that was used in the Canaanite pantheon. But why not?
Abraham is traditionally called the first monotheist, but his relationship with God seems to have been very similar to his neighbors' relationships with their pagan gods. The Bible itself seems to suggest this.
He was sitting at the entrance to his tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. He ran to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, and let me fetch a morsel of bread." Genesis 18:1.
You'd be very likely to see a god, experience a vision of a god in a grove, or suddenly see a god in human form. And sometimes Abraham would even share a meal with God or argue with God, almost as an equal. So later that would be a quite shocking idea to later Jews, but Abraham felt very comfortable with this because he was living in a very different world.
The sacrifice of animals was one of the ways early pagans communed with their gods. For Abraham, it was no different.
And he said, "O Lord, how am I to know that I will possess this land?" And God answered, "Bring me a cow, a goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird." And Abraham brought them and cut them in two. Genesis 15:8.
In the ancient world, every religion that I've come across practiced some form of sacrifice. Sacrifice was felt to be important because it stressed the interrelationship between God and human beings. The gods were offered the flesh of the animal that had been killed, and then the people here below would partake of this dedicated meat, and they would therefore share a meal with the gods.
Sacrifice is a central concept because, in a sense, people say if you really mean it, there should be something you're ready to give for it, and maybe even give up for it. If you believe in it deeply enough, why do people die in battle? Why do people give their lives to save another's life?
In some pagan cults, however, animal sacrifice was not always enough. There were times when a costlier sacrifice was required. A human sacrifice, or even a child. This was another ritual that found its way into Abraham's life.
God put Abraham to the test, and he said, "Take your son, your only son, your son whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him to me there as a burnt offering." Genesis 22:1.
The story of the binding of Isaac, which is probably the most profound and difficult, and in its own strange way, most cherished of the stories in Jewish understandings of faith, tells a lot about the transactions of God and humans, or humans and God. On the one hand, it makes Abraham look like nothing but a child killer because he, in that story, would have killed his son. Most scholars look at that in a different way. That is, the history of the times tells us child sacrifice was very common, and it's often remarked that this is the last such story in the Hebrew Scriptures. In a sense, this is the one by God providing a ram to be sacrificed instead of the son, is making the grand shift in understanding of faith, understanding of God, and saying from now on, I will not ask you to do something as drastic as that.
It would be Abraham's grandson, Jacob, last of the biblical patriarchs, who would encounter God in an even more intimate way than his ancestors.
And a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. And when he saw that he had not prevailed, he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But he answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Said the other, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have wrestled with God and prevailed." Jacob asked, "What is your name?" And he said, "You must not ask." And he took his leave. Genesis 32:24.
To me, I'm gripped by the mystery. I mean, who is this creature? Is it a divine creature? What does it mean to wrestle all night for hours beyond exhaustion? I also love the point that, in the end, that one relates to God and to humans, not simply obediently and not simply triumphantly, but in wrestling. And that, I think, is one of the profoundest truths of the Jewish tradition. We wrestle between the infinite God beyond comprehension and the God so close that one can almost touch and feel.
At the end of his wrestling match, Jacob asks the visitor to tell him his name, and the visitor refuses. In the ancient world, to know somebody's name, even to know the name of a god, gave you power and control over them. In their cults, people would intone the name of a god again and again, and thought they'd be able thereby to manipulate this god and make him do what they want. But this God says, no, you may not know my name, you may not control me in this way, and he disappears. There is a slight shift here. The God of Jacob is beginning to move a little way away from the usual paganism.
So, in the end, as different and as extraordinarily radical as Judaism is in relation to its culture around it, that doesn't happen in one step and overnight. It grows.
The new ideas about God that were beginning to emerge with the biblical patriarchs would soon take new form. This would happen at a time of great upheaval, when the patriarchs' descendants were liberated from slavery in Egypt by God and his prophet Moses. The God of Moses and the Exodus would no longer be the close-at-hand God of the patriarchs. Rather, God would now be cloaked in mystery and would also come bearing a mysterious new name. Monotheism was born out of an era when gods were approachable. The God the biblical patriarchs experienced proved much the same. But this was about to change. Approximately 3,600 years ago, a great famine struck the land of Canaan, and Jacob, last of the biblical patriarchs, sought food with his family in the land of Egypt. Biblical tradition says that Jacob's descendants prospered greatly in Egypt at first, but when they became too numerous and powerful, the Egyptians grew fearful of them and forced them into slavery. After some 400 years of bondage, God called on Moses with a mission to lead Jacob's descendants, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
And Moses looked up, and there was a bush that burned but was not consumed. And God called to him from the bush and said, "Moses, Moses." And he replied, "Here I am." God answered, "Come no closer. Take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground." Exodus 3:2.
Overwhelmed, Moses asks the same question that Jacob asked after he wrestled with God. "What is your name?" This time, God does answer, but calls himself by a name that is really not a name. Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, or Yahweh, I am what I am.
The God of Moses is a very different God from that friendly deity who had dinner with Abraham. In the burning bush, God gives his name to Moses, Eyeh Asher Eyeh, which becomes Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. And this is a mysterious phrase. It's actually a Hebrew idiom of deliberate vagueness. And what God is in effect saying to Moses is, mind your own business. Never you mind who I am. This is a God, again, who cannot be manipulated. You cannot use his name or control him. He will be what he will be.
And one great student of religion back in the 20th century, Rudolf Otto, called this the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. It does two things. It is tremendous, it blows you away. Take the shoes off your feet, Moses hears, because the ground you're standing on is holy ground. Get out of here, you're nothing. And there's another side to it. There's a fascination to it. You're almost like the bug that is constantly being lured, the moth that sees the flame that's always coming up to it. So it is with the holy. You can't stand it, and you can't do without it. And that's a very common theme throughout the biblical understandings of how you deal with the mystery of God.
For the Israelites, who were slaves yearning for redemption, El, the personal God of their ancestors, was no longer enough. They needed a dynamic, mysterious God to liberate them. Yahweh was such a God. 10 miraculous plagues are visited on Egypt, some of which are direct assaults on Egyptian deities. First, the Nile is turned into a river of blood, followed by lice, locusts, hail, boils, and a total darkness which spreads over the land. Finally, God slays the firstborn son in every Egyptian family. The slave masters can take no more. Pharaoh gives in and lets the Israelites leave Egypt.
With the Exodus story, what Moses brings to the table is a certain realization that this is the liberating God. This is the God who, out of desire for human dignity and human value, and out of love for humans, is their liberator, is the one who smashes absolute dictatorship, in this case Pharaoh's dictatorship, and in effect points the fact that never again will any human ruler be absolute, but rather only God is absolute, which makes all human rulers relative.
The stories of Moses and the deliverance of Israel is attracted by us and attractive to us, Afro-Americans, because our experience is so much alike. And so our experience of being enslaved, being enslaved by tough slave masters, having to work beyond reasonable expectations, make brick without straw, having to just be the underdog, the downtrodden dog, like Israel. That's our history. God hearing our prayers. There can be no greater miracle than how the Lord decided to deliver Afro-Americans from slavery.
The God of the Exodus was wonderful and liberating if you happened to be an Israelite, but he was not so wonderful and liberating if you were an Egyptian who suffered greatly at the hands of this God. God is called Yahweh Sabaoth, God of armies, and he is essentially a tribal God. He's not yet a universal God. The Egyptians had their own gods, and he is fighting the gods of the Egyptians. He's passionately partisan on the side of his own people alone, and is ready to kill all their enemies if necessary.
Liberated from Egypt, the Israelites set forth into the desert of Sinai, to the mountain where God had appeared in the burning bush. Their encounter with Yahweh at Mount Sinai would define their relationship with God in clear terms.
On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud on the mountain, and the people trembled. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Exodus 19:16.
The Greek Orthodox loved the image of Moses going up the mountain and being enveloped in thick cloud, where he was with God in the place where God was but could not see him. And they used that as a powerful image to say, yes, you could be with God, but don't think you'll ever see God clearly, ever be able to define God, to know his nature.
One of our church fathers, Gregory Palamas, wrote, if we say God is, we must say we are not. By which he meant God is not a supreme being or being of any kind as we are. So, what is? God is. He is. He is the isness of is.
If you limit God, even in your imagination, you are creating God. Because imagination is but the summation of the five senses in the memory. Then you assemble them in your computer in a certain way and come out with an imagination. So you are creating God. You cannot do that to God.
This new, mysterious, inconceivable nature of one supreme God is made clear in the second of the 10 Commandments delivered on Mount Sinai.
You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above. Exodus 23.
But the old idea of accessible gods, perhaps closer and more comforting, would prove hard to let go. Even as God delivers the commandments to Moses atop Mount Sinai, his people grow tired of waiting. They build a golden bull, a traditional image of the pagan god El, and hold lavish feasts and dances at the foot of the mountain.
Here was this incredible moment of Sinai, thunder, lightning, liberation, all these wonderful things, and God said, I am the Lord your God, no other gods before me. They turn around and, not seeing Moses or seeing God, create a golden calf that they can see and touch and dance before. So if you expect people to change overnight, your heart's going to be broken. And it shouldn't shock anybody if it was impossible to shake off the habits of idolatry in 1 week or 1 day or even 1 generation.
However, in worshiping the golden bull, were the Israelites trying to close the gap that was beginning to open between God and humanity? Did they hope that some of the closeness their ancestors felt to God might be recovered?
There's always been a strong impulse in the religions to make icons, images, in the Hebrew scriptures, idols, because you can grab them and you can talk to them and so on. And we still get a great sense out of the tangible.
At the heart of all monotheistic religions is an inescapable tension. You're insisting on this cosmic, eternal God beyond all imagination, and at the same time insisting that that God cares about me personally, this little insignificant speck in a vast universe. So there is a kind of a paradox there, and people naturally sometimes focus on one side or other of this tension. Listen, when I'm sick in the hospital, that's when I want that God who's so close that the rabbis say is the divine presence right at the head of the bed. And sometimes when I look at this vast starry universe, maybe through the eyes of a Van Gogh, I'm just overwhelmed by this ineffable cosmic transcendent God.
At Mount Sinai, the Israelites had shown how difficult it was for them to adapt to new ideas of God. In the tumultuous times following their wanderings in the desert, when the Israelites settled in the Holy Land, new facets of God's nature would emerge. Jealousy and vengefulness. The changing nature of God would present extraordinary struggle and hardship for the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. And yet, these same prophets would also reveal a God both gentle and compassionate. How the Israelites come to terms with the emerging complexities in God's nature will dictate the survival of the Hebrew faith, and perhaps monotheism itself. It was during the Exodus from Egypt, some 1,200 years before Christ, that God revealed himself as a shrouded mystery and forbade his people from worshiping other gods. Yet, when the Israelites returned to the land of Canaan, after receiving God's law at Mount Sinai, they seemed to forget God's commandment, that thou shalt have no other gods before me. Enter some of the most unusual figures in all of biblical history, the prophets.
The stories of the prophets show that the people of Israel were having great difficulty in making this change. Sometimes the prophets behave in ways that seem to be unnatural and difficult. Ezekiel, for example, is told by God to eat excrement, and he has to walk around town with his bags packed like a refugee. Jeremiah experiences the divine impact as a sort of pain that fills his every limb and causes him to stagger around like a drunk. After Ezekiel's had his huge vision of God at the beginning, where he sees God in a divine chariot, he feels as though he's been knocked out. And I think this indicates that the Israelites were finding it very difficult to pull themselves away, to wrench themselves away from the mythical consciousness that prevailed in the Middle East.
One of the most powerful champions of Yahweh was the prophet Elijah, whose very name meant Yahweh is my God. Elijah lived in the 9th century BC, a time when worship of the Canaanite god Baal had again grown popular among the Israelites. Queen Jezebel, a pagan from Lebanon who had married Israel's King Ahab, was Baal's leading proponent. Now, a severe drought strikes the land. The Israelites turn to Baal, pagan god of storms, for rain. Elijah is enraged.
How long will you keep hopping between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him, and if Baal, follow him. 1 Kings 18:21.
Elijah builds 2 altars at Mount Carmel, one for Yahweh and one for Baal, and places a sacrifice on each. He then challenges the prophets of Baal to invoke their God. Try as they might, these prophets are unable to summon rain. Then Elijah calls upon Yahweh. Fire falls from the heavens and consumes the altar. The Israelites fall on their faces, stunned. Yahweh is God, they cry. Soon after, torrential rains break, replenishing the land.
Mount Carmel is to decide the question, who makes the weather? Who makes the rain? Is it Baal, or is it the God of Israel? There's been a drought, part of God's displeasure with going to Baal for the weather, for the rain. So the fire, the heavenly fire comes down, consumes the sacrifice, and then the point of the exercise, the cloud comes up, and point made, I make the rain.
With the drought over, Elijah is not generous in victory. He orders the priests of Baal seized and taken to a nearby valley where all 450 of them are slaughtered.
I sometimes think that this was the divine frustration, get rid of idolatry once and for all. So idolatry is the classic case in Jewish tradition where there's no compromise, no acceptance of the idea of little by little will cure, but rather burn it, destroy it. As soon as you win the upper hand, smash and kill all the priests of the Baal.
Fearing for his life, Elijah flees to the Sinai desert, to the very mountain where God had revealed himself in thunder and smoke to Moses. Frightened and alone, Elijah stands in a crevice of a rock. A vision of God appears, and Elijah shields himself from what he expects will be the devastating presence of the God of Mount Sinai. But Elijah is in for a surprise.
Thence came a mighty wind, so strong it tore the mountains and shattered the rocks before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire came the sound of a gentle breeze. And when Elijah heard this, he covered his face with a cloak. 1 Kings 19:11.
He is not in the storm, he's not in the roaring wind, but he's there in the scarcely perceptible sound of a breeze. Still, quiet voice. So the idea that God is not in the natural forces anymore, and it is barely audible, is again another small move away from the regular paganism.
Elijah, fleeing the prophets of idolatry, goes in search of God and finds God not in thunder, not in lightning, but in a still small voice, or in the voice of silence, the sound of silence. I'd say that the quiet, still small voice reflects a greater maturity. The still small voice speaks out of our heart and to our mind and soul, and that in the end reflects a much deeper level both of understanding and commitment.
Elijah had discovered that God could be jealous and even cruel, but he could also be quiet and even gentle. He was all of these and more. He was beyond human expectations. He was transcendent.
The word transcendence means that which goes beyond our normal experience. Throughout human history, men and women have experienced a hidden sacred dimension of life which is beyond their normal thoughts, ideas and experiences. And we seek ecstasy. We seek to go beyond ourselves and experience this this dimension of something else. And if we don't find it in religion, we'll look for it in other activities, in art, in sport, in sex, in drugs, even mistakenly. Because this is the way we are constituted. We are, as human beings, able to have experiences and to conceive of ideas that go beyond what we can grasp. This is part of the human condition.
150 years after Elijah, another prophet appears whose encounter with God and history will change the Hebrew faith yet again. His name is Isaiah. It is about 745 BC. Isaiah, a member of the royal family of Judea, has a shocking vision of Yahweh. As he stands in the temple of Jerusalem, a sweet-smelling cloud of incense mingles with the reeking blood of sacrifices. In the cloud, Isaiah sees Yahweh seated on his heavenly throne. With God are two powerful angels who cry out to one another.
Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh. His glory fills the whole world. Isaiah 6:3.
Holy, I think the first and deepest, oldest meaning is other. And you can associate a number of related words with that. Dreadful, terrible in the old sense. Not terrible as in yuck, but terrible as in awful as in full of awe. Dread as in, think of a feeling you had when you thought there might be a ghost in the camp, around the camp. You know, when the hairs in the back of your head in the back of your neck start to go up. That times a million.
Isaiah's direct encounter with God, the other, is so terrifying that he literally fears for his life.
What a wretched state I am in, he cried. I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. Then one of the seraphs flew to him, holding a live coal from the altar, and touched his mouth with it. Isaiah 6:5.
It's painful to make change. It's sometimes painful to leave our old religious experience behind and embrace something entirely new. And I think these prophetic stories underline that whole difficulty.
And now, a new transition for the Israelites' vision of God is about to occur. It would come when the great empire of Babylon conquers the Israelites and forces them into exile. Within this turmoil, God would finally move beyond the struggle with pagan deities. The Israelites would begin to experience God as holy and singular. Monotheism, as we know it today, is finally on the horizon. The Israelites had been settled in Canaan for almost 500 years when the prophet Isaiah had his vision of a God that was holy, holy, holy. Ancient Israel had broken in two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judea. It was a period in history when religions around the world were coming into sharp focus. A period between 800 and 200 BC, known as the Axial Age.
The Axial Age is so called because it is the point around which the whole of human history revolves. It's the pivotal point, the axis upon which all future religious and spiritual development turns. It was at this point, in three core areas of the world, that the religions that have continued to nourish human beings develop, what we call the Great World Faiths. In China, you have the rise of Confucianism and Taoism. In the Middle East, you have monotheism. In the Indian subcontinent, you have Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. And in Europe, you have Greek rationalism. These faiths have continued to give human beings hope and that life has some meaning and value. And it was a radical break with the old paganism.
Rapid changes were occurring for humanity. People were beginning to gather in big cities. A market economy was developing. Merchants trampled the weak and vulnerable in their stampede for wealth. After generations of rural existence, people must have found this new city life strange and frightening. Another significant change in the axial age was the quantum growth of violence. New global empires clashed with one another, which resulted in untold numbers of people being killed or driven from their homes.
Life was often becoming more aggressive, and so to counteract this, all of them promoted the doctrine of compassion, respect for the sacred rights of others, justice, and even philosophies of non-violence.
This global upheaval called for a new approach to God. Old pagan gods, limited and local, seemed less and less relevant. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel and scattered them to the winds. Isaiah warned the people of Judea that their kingdom would be next if they did not confront their shortcomings and embrace compassion.
Says the Lord, what need have I of all your sacrifices? Bringing offerings is futile. Though you may pray, I will not listen. Your hands are stained in blood. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Search for justice, help the oppressed. Be just to the orphan, plead for the widow. Isaiah 1:15.
The fact that Isaiah tells the Israelites that Yahweh considers compassion more important than animal sacrifice represents a revolutionary and difficult break with the old pagan ways.
Mankind tend to be vengeance-minded. Mankind tends to be eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But wait a moment. If compassion is difficult for us, who are as guilty of sin as the one to whom we are to be compassionate, then how much more is it difficult for God to understand how we so readily seek His blessings and His compassion?
The ability to enter the life of someone else, to share their joys, but most of all their sorrows, to be at their side, to get the dispersed ones together into company, is always a common picture. And if we ask ourselves why people keep on being believers, I don't think it usually is because of the warrior God, or the God who asks Abraham for the sacrifice of his son, or the God who wrestles with Jacob, or the God who thunders on Sinai. People stay with it because they experience that this God comes to them as one who suffers with them.
Compassion is hard because it forces us to dethrone ourselves from the center of our universe. Now, we don't like doing this. We often prefer to fulfill our own desires, our own needs, our own ambitions, often at the expense of other people. And we don't like to be reminded that we should see other people as perhaps even more important than ourselves.
And so the call by a compassionate God for the same quality in His human creations would go largely unheeded by the people of Judea. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquers Jerusalem, destroys the city, and deports most of the people. Throughout history, gods have always been tied to a particular territory. As they sat beside the rivers of Babylon, the exiles must have felt they would not be able to practice their religion outside the promised land.
Certainly we do know from the writings of the prophets in the exile that some Israelites gave up on Yahweh and decided the sensible thing to do was to worship the local gods, as people had always done.
A new prophet now emerges for the people of Judea exiled in Babylon, so far from the God of their homeland. He is known to us as Second Isaiah, and he preaches a truly radical idea that Yahweh is not only the national God of the children of Israel, but the God of all the nations.
Many Israelites thought that the gods of Assyria and then the gods of Babylon and finally the gods of Persia were more powerful because these were the winners. But under pressure of this terror and this fear and pain of being wiped out, losing their homeland, losing their kingdom, the prophets began to think about God as the only God. They said that God was controlling Assyria. God was controlling Persia. He was controlling Cyrus, the king of the Persians, to fulfill his own wish for his people.
Faced with their exile and the constant threat to their faith from Babylon's cosmopolitan culture, the Judeans cling to the one thing they have left, Yahweh. They put their faith in the God that had delivered their ancestors from Egypt. He was masterminding history. He was the only deity that matters. For the first time in history, the very existence of pagan gods was being challenged.
No God was formed before me, nor will be after me. I am Yahweh. There is no other Savior. Isaiah 45:21.
To Jews who lived in Jerusalem, who felt literally the temple was right there where you could almost touch and feel the presence of God, God was so concretely present in Israel, it's almost like if you left Israel, there would be no God. But for the Jews who were exiled and sent out of Jerusalem and lost that contact, and suddenly discovered, miracle, after all, God is present. This is a cosmic God, as present in Babylonia, as in Jerusalem, as present all over the world, as in the heartland of Jewish encounter.
With 2nd Isaiah's unequivocal vision of Yahweh as the one and only God, the religion now called Judaism has fully emerged from the old Israelite beliefs. The axial age has brought forth a strictly monotheistic faith. 500 years will pass before a new vision of God arrives in the Holy Land. It will come in the footsteps and the teachings of a wandering preacher in the Galilee. It is 600 years after Isaiah's teaching of a universal God. The Jews have returned to their homeland from exile in Babylon and are now under the control of Rome, the most powerful empire the world had yet seen. While the Jews are granted full religious freedom, Rome still rules with a heavy hand. It is also a time of religious ferment, when many Jews are struggling to find new ways of interpreting Jewish law. There are also those Jews who believe that the Messiah, anointed by God, will soon arrive to usher in God's kingdom on earth. Humanity's vision of God is about to change once again.
At the time that Jesus was born, the world of Judea was in tremendous turmoil because that country was dominated by the Roman armies and the Roman magistrates ruling under the power of the Roman emperor. Some wanted to throw it off by force by developing guerrilla armies and fighting the Romans militarily. And others were convinced that things were so bad that God would finally come and destroy the world as it was and transform it. Jesus seems to have thought that.
After Jesus was crucified, some Jews in Jerusalem claimed he had been the Messiah. They believed that Jesus had risen from the dead to be the Redeemer of Israel. Followers of the new faith were called Christians because they believed that Jesus had been the Christos, Greek for Messiah. At first, Christianity was accepted as an authentic, if peculiar, Jewish sect.
The Christians, in their New Testament stories, do something Very strange. They take over the entire canon, the approved books of another religion, in a sense, and make it their own. They may share the same God, they may share the same covenant, but it's very different to look out the window and say Messiah will come, and to look out the window and say Messiah has come. The world will be redeemed, the world has been redeemed.
What makes it hard to say what Jesus' message was is that we don't have any first-hand transcriptions. He didn't write anything. All we have are accounts that are written a generation to 2 generations later, which are the Gospels of the New Testament. And they say rather different things. The Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest, says that Jesus announced the coming kingdom of God. But others wondered, what does he mean by that kingdom? Does it mean a king? Does it mean a new political regime? Does it mean throwing out the Romans? Or does it mean some kind of spiritual state, which the Gospel of Luke suggests?
Jesus never calls himself God, or even Son of God, really, though he often called God Father, Abba, because he felt, I think, close to God. He felt God as a sort of close paternal figure in his life. St. Paul does call Jesus Son of God, but this is in the Jewish sense, where a son of God, a child of God, was someone who had a special job to do, who was specially close to God, a perfectly ordinary human being like the Messiah.
Christians were not yet claiming that Jesus was divine, but that he had a special relationship with God. This intimacy can be seen in the story of the transfiguration of Jesus on Mount Tabor.
Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain. In their presence he was transfigured. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them. Then a cloud appeared over the group, and a voice spoke from the cloud, "This is my son, the beloved. He enjoys my favor. Listen to him." Matthew 17:1.
Most Jews refused to accept the idea of Jesus as the risen Messiah. Paul, a recent convert, takes the newborn faith to the largely pagan Roman Empire. In seeking to spread Christianity, Paul travels widely. He tells all he meets that Jesus was not only the Redeemer of the Jews, but of the whole world. It is yet another pivotal point in the history of God, as monotheism now begins to spread beyond the boundaries of Judea and into the worlds of Greece and Rome.
The early Christian movement came into a world that was pagan, which what we mean by that is simply a huge range of religious options in the ancient world. And for most people, this Christian movement that said that this man was a god and you could eat his flesh and drink his blood in a ritual was very much like what people said about the god Mithra, who was a Persian version of the sun god, whom they also said was born in a miraculous way, and shepherds came when he was born. No one actually knows when Jesus was born, but it was set by Christians since the 4th century on the birthday of the god Mithra, the 25th of December. If we think about what the Roman gods look like, we realize that the gods of the Greeks and Romans, they look very much like the emperor and his court. But here was a movement that said that a man who was illiterate, from a poor family, with absolutely no pretensions, who suffered the death of a slave or a traitor, nevertheless was a person in whom God was present. That could suggest to the many people who were neglected and treated with great contempt in the Roman world, in which so many were slaves or illiterate, that even in a person like that, God could be present.
This central message of hope spread quickly throughout the Roman Empire. As the Christian faithful became more varied, so did their understanding of Jesus and of their relationship to God.
If you read the letters of Paul, which come before the Gospels, and then you read the Gospels, and then you read the late letters that come up in the end of the New Testament, You are introduced to churches all over the place that are very different in character from each other. I like to say that if you could really know the church in Corinth and Ephesus and Rome and Jerusalem and Antioch, they'd be as different as the church of the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. Sometimes Jesus is the Logos, the Word of God that exists before the incarnation of Jesus. Sometimes he's the adopted son.
During Christianity's first 3 centuries, the followers of the new faith were persecuted by Rome, which did not tolerate religious innovation. However, once Christianity became a powerful force in the empire, the nature of Jesus' relation to God became an important focus of religious contemplation and debate. It all seemed to come down to 2 questions. Was Jesus divine in the same way as God? And if Jesus was divine, could he really be called a human being at all?
A fierce debate sprang up in the early 4th century in Alexandria in Egypt. Arius, a charismatic, eloquent young priest in the diocese, started saying that Jesus was not divine in the same way as the Father. He was a human being who'd been promoted to divine status because of his perfect obedience to God. Now, this did not please Athanasius, the young, brilliant assistant of the bishop, and a royal fight broke out in all the major churches, and the churches were found they were split down the middle on this question, and the Emperor Constantine could not have his new church, which he hoped to make a state church one day, split in 2. It was supposed to unite the empire, not drag it apart. So he summoned a council to Nicaea in the year 325 to get the things sorted out once and for all.
It was at the Council of Nicaea that Jesus was declared to be fully divine. Although it was not actually composed at the meeting, a proclamation known as the Nicene Creed was recognized in almost all Christian churches by the next century. The Creed, for the first time, codified the now official Christian doctrine that Jesus the Redeemer and God the Creator were one and the same.
We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, the Nicene Creed.
Nevertheless, the Eastern churches continued to debate the matter. What did it mean to say that the utterly transcendent God had become a human being? Had the all-powerful God really been a helpless baby? Had the Eternal died on a cross? Why had God done any of this? Eastern and Western churches developed very different answers to these questions. The Western Church developed the idea that God had come down to earth in the human Jesus in order to save humanity from the original sin of Adam in the Garden of Eden.
God had to become flesh because once upon a time he told man, if you disobey me and eat of this fruit, you shall surely die. They ate of it. They began the eternal line of their offsprings being born in sin, sin in the bloodline, all the way down to me and to you. All men of all times either had to die and go to hell, or there had to be a plan to save him. God has provided the plan. I can go down and manifest myself among mankind as God the Son. I can live among them. I can be tempted as they were tempted. I can literally be tried and punished to death, and I can die, a substitute for the whole death.
The Eastern Church, on the other hand, believed God would have become man even if Adam had not sinned. Jesus was the first deified human being, and all Christians could strive for this enlightened state by following him.
But if one presumes that there is God and that God acts in some way, how would this God reveal himself, herself, to us, other than through the human form? Where do we look for God? We look for God first and foremost in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and subsequently in those in whom Christ is present. Who is Jesus of Nazareth for us? I would say he is the glory of God. He is this glory made flesh.
Once Christians decided that Jesus was divine, they faced a new problem. Were there now, in fact, two gods, a Father and a Son? The struggle to define Jesus and his relationship to God and all of humanity would eventually give rise to a single, powerful idea: the belief that God in fact reveals himself to the world in three ways: as Father, as Son, and as Holy Spirit. It is a belief that would come to be called the Trinity. It is the 4th century after Christ. The new Christian church now faces a crucial question. If Jesus himself was divine in the same way as God, how could Christians be monotheists?
When it was decided that Jesus was divine in the same way as God the Father, Christians were understandably confused. I mean, were there two gods? Then there was the question of the Holy Spirit, a Jewish way of talking about the divine presence in the world. So were there three gods? How could you be monotheists?
It's certainly not monotheism. The idea that you have God in different forms, or God in three beings, that of course is very hard to reconcile with monotheism, but this kind of religious image has never been overly worried about logic.
In order to bring clarity to this puzzle, 3 bishops teamed up to consider this problem: Basil, Bishop of Caesarea, his brother Gregory, Bishop of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. The doctrine they constructed would become known as the Trinity, the teaching that God makes himself known to humanity in 3 different ways: as Father, as Word, and as Holy Spirit. All 3 of these church fathers were deeply spiritual men who were trying to communicate to ordinary people the deep truths about the divine mystery in terms they could understand. What Basil and the 2 Gregories said was this: just as a priest leaves the sanctuary at the beginning of the Mass and then walks among the people in order to bless them, so too did God leave his solitary, mysterious splendor in order to join his human creatures.
They decided that God's essence, God as God is in God's self, is always beyond our comprehension. We'll never get to know it. But God is active in the world. They talked about God's energies, God's activities, God's dynamics in the world. And these have been experienced in 3 ways. We've experienced God as Father, as a paternal figure. God is the source of our being, like a father. We've experienced God as Word. God has spoken to us in creation, God has spoken to us in the person of Jesus, and God has spoken to us in Scripture. And also they experienced God within the depths of their own being as spirit. These were the three ways in which we experience the utterly ineffable, indescribable God.
The three Greek bishops made a sharp distinction between God's inner nature, which humanity can never grasp, and the human experience of the divine mystery. God, they said, reveals himself to people in rather the same way that people reveal themselves to one another. When people communicate, they use words, movements, and facial expressions. These gestures can relay some of what is meant, but can never express the innermost self of the person who is trying to communicate. Just as people often feel that words are inadequate in expressing themselves, so too are God's gestures towards us limited by what human beings can comprehend. The paradox of the Trinity reminds Christians that God is always a mystery, beyond human ideas.
The Trinity is not a natural thought. There's a lovely expression by a Russian theologian, Vladimir Lossky. The Trinity is the cross for human ways of thought, by which he means you have to die, in a sense, before you can enter into the contemplation of the Trinity properly. It is not a logical construction by any means.
The Trinity may be seen like a poem, which is a way of expressing something that is too elusive to be stated in logical writing. Gregory of Nazianzus may have felt such poetic emotion when he meditated on the Trinity.
No sooner do I conceive of the one than I am illumined by the splendor of the three. No sooner do I distinguish the three than I am carried back to the one. When I think of any of the three, I think of him as the whole, and my eyes are filled with tears, and the greater part of what I am thinking escapes me. Gregory of Nazianzus.
The Greek Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity is meant to be experienced intuitively. In the West, this mystical, even poetic dimension has often been missed.
In the Western world, theologians didn't always understand the Greek terminology of Greek Trinitarianism, and they weren't as interested in abstract metaphysical ideas in the same way as the Greeks. St. Augustine, who was active in North Africa in the early 5th century, put forward a new idea of Trinity, which was more suitable for the West. It was more psychological. Augustine was very interested in psychology, in the workings of the mind, and he saw God as having three aspects in his mind. In our human minds, he said, we have three powers. We have memory, understanding, and will, that which makes us act and which makes us love. And he said, similarly, in God, you have three powers, Father, Son, and Spirit, that correspond to these three mental activities. The Greeks didn't like that, however. They revered St. Augustine, but they said, it makes God too much like a man again, and he'll never entirely be contained in human words or thoughts.
Given this sense of unrelenting mystery, how would the Church build a bridge between an utterly transcendent, indescribable God and the fragile world that is his creation? How can an unknowable God make himself known to human beings? As with the Trinity, other theologies also speak of different aspects of an unknowable God.
There are other instances of this kind of spirituality. In the Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, for example, you have a very similar notion of God, God Ein Sof, God without end, who can never be known by human beings, which is inaccessible, but which graciously makes itself known to us, not in 3, but in 10 emanations or extensions of itself, and these are called Sephirot. Also, you have a trio of gods in Hinduism, Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, who all reflect aspects together of the utterly indescribable, utterly mysterious and transcendent Brahman.
Perhaps all of the paradoxical ideas about God found in most religions are meant to remind humanity that God cannot be contained in a neat system of thought or theory. While the theological debate over the Trinity was unfolding in the middle of the first millennium after Christ, another significant transformation was occurring to the east, in Arabia. A new revelation was about to occur to a man named Muhammad, whom the Arabs would come to call God's last prophet on earth. With the revelation of the Quran, the Arabian world would begin its own journey to monotheism, in a faith called Islam. "300 years after the Trinity was formulated in Turkey, and on the extreme other end of the Mideast, a merchant had a revelation of God that would again revolutionize a desert people's world. Out of this prophet's vision of God would emerge the third great monotheist faith, Islam.
We believe that God created history. So the idea of there is a history which is like a flowing river, and at a certain stage God was introduced, we don't think that this is substantiated. So we don't subscribe to the idea that God developed according to the needs, as if this is a God that we created. No, in Islam, God is the reality of all realities. It is the beginning before any beginning, the everlasting after any end.
The revelation of Islam's holy book of the Quran came when the Arabs were beginning to enter the wider world through trade. By this time, the early 7th century, many Arabs believed that the God worshipped by Jews and Christians was the same as Allah, the high God of their pagan world. Yet most Arabs were unwilling to adopt either of these two older faiths.
The Arabs had their own pagan religion, which had satisfied them for centuries. At the head was the high god Allah, whose name simply means God. And so by the time of Muhammad, many of the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula had come to think that Allah was the same as the God worshipped by the Jews and the Christians.
Nevertheless, God had not yet sent the Arabs a prophet of their own. There were no Arabic scriptures. All this would change one night in the year 610. It was then that a 40-year-old merchant named Muhammad ibn Abdullah was suddenly awakened from his sleep.
He felt enveloped by a devastating divine presence that squeezed him so forcefully he could not breathe. The angel commanded Muhammad to recite, but Muhammad could not speak. The terrifying vision, terrible pressure in the command came twice again. On the third repetition, the first words of a new scripture poured forth. Recite in the name of thy sustainer, who has created man out of a germ cell. Quran 96:1.
Muhammad had uttered the first words of the Quran, which means recitation. It is said that when Muslims hear the Quran read out loud, they feel they are in God's presence, that God speaks to them through this scripture. Muslims believe that Muhammad was able to receive this divine word because he submitted his entire life to God.
The word Islam means surrender. A Muslim is a man or a woman who has made this existential surrender of his or her whole being to Allah.
Islam is the peace that comes after the submission of your will to the will of God, that kind of wonderfully warm feeling that comes after the terror of giving over a thing to God.
One of the first things that Muhammad asked his converts to do was to prostrate themselves in prayer several times a day. The external postures of their body taught them at a level deeper than the rational that they must abandon the prancing ego and yield themselves, give themselves over entirely to Allah, to the divine.
There's a well-stated phrase of Malcolm X that talks about the hardest thing of all of the things for him to do in Islam was to prostrate, because it had been so ingrained in him that I will not bow down. And while this wasn't in front of any man, it was the notion of bowing down on the floor to the unseen.
Where Christians had developed a notion of God as Trinity, Muslims returned to the older Hebrew idea of God's unity. It is a concept central to Islamic spirituality. If a Muslim orders his or her life correctly, God is in first place and other values and desires are in a subordinate position. Muslims call this making one, or Tawheed.
Tawheed simply means the belief in the oneness and uniqueness of God. So it is not only numerical. It is qualitative and quantitative. It is one God, nothing is like unto him, everything else came from him. That's very central because it is very liberating. It means that there is no other power in my life that deserves me to submit to, or to bow before, or to abide by, other than this absolute one supreme sublime God, which is expressed in the words of Shahada in Islam, La ilaha illallah, there is no deity save God.
One religious practice central to Islam that expresses Tawheed is the Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca. At the peak of the Hajj in that holy city, the faithful, in unison, move around the ancient shrine of the Kaaba.
Running around a shrine may seem an odd way to conduct your piety, but in fact it's a rather good meditative exercise, because as you circle round and round the Kaaba, which represents God, you're learning to put God at the center of things, to orient yourself, to place yourself in relation to the divine. And as you circle around Allah, you realize that your whole life must circle and center round God, who is its focus.
Going around and around, the Muslims are saying, here we are, God, we respond to your call, here we come. So it is a very powerful expression of Tawheed, of monotheism. And it is really impacting when you see that.
As the Iranian philosopher Ali Shariati wrote,
as you circumambulate and move closer to the Kaaba, you feel like a small stream merging with a big river. As you approach the center, the pressure of the crowd squeezes you so hard that you are given new life. You are now part of the people. You are now a man, alive and eternal, circumambulating around Allah. You will soon forget yourself.
So it's people all over the world, not any longer just the Muslim world, coming together, meeting each other for the first time. Most of the world is really quite homogenous. And it's an opportunity to see some of the heterogeneity in the world, the wonderful diversity that exists amongst people, all believing in the same tradition.
It doesn't matter who is black, who is white, who is yellow. You cannot know who is rich, who is poor, because they are dressed in the most simple, in two towels. There is no place for showing off at all. All this group of people melts together in a one stream going around the symbol in complete and utter equality. and in complete and utter sense of brotherhood.
In Islam, this brotherhood is called the Ummah, or community. The experience of community is one of the central ways in which humanity experiences God in all three monotheistic faiths.
The Bible says it is not good for the human to exist or to live alone. This implies that the fullness of my own humanity emerges only in community, in being part of something larger, in the sustaining force of love. And when the idea of prayer in a minyan, in a mini community with a quorum, somehow this prayer is more powerful, is received by God, even though I can pray to God anywhere, anytime, all alone, yet somehow if I pray with the community, it's closer. God is closer, the prayer gets further.
The power of community goes beyond prayer. For Muslims, the Quran commands that they create a just and equal society in which the vulnerable are treated with respect. Politics as sacred duty.
The role of politics in Islam needs to be understood in a more profound way than it is handled in America or in the West. And the Quran indicates it that you ought to stand with the oppressed against the oppressor, across the board. The dignity of human being. Quran says that we bestowed dignity on the progeny of Adam. That this cuts through race, color, and creed. Diversity is the will of God. The more we respect God, the more we should respect the diversity. Are we doing that? Probably not. Probably not to the level and to the caliber that's expected from those who believe in God.
Muhammad himself did not require Jews or Christians under Islamic rule to convert to Islam. Indeed, the Quran teaches that all moral religions come from God, and Islam accepts Abraham, Moses, Elijah, Isaiah, and Jesus as prophets. The Quran calls Jews and Christians people of the book.
For remember, all men come from Adam, and Adam came from dust. And then Muhammad quoted from the Quran, O people, we have called you into tribes and nations so that you may know one another. Quran 49:13.
This is a great declaration because it's saying that you don't make community the end of the story. Your experience of living together in harmony with other human beings within your own community should act as a springboard to enable you to understand other people who belong to other communities.
Many centuries have passed since Muhammad's revelation, last of the great epiphanies that founded the three Western faiths. And yet, the quest for the divine has continued to evolve. Crimes against humanity have brought some to say that God is no longer relevant or even dead. And so, a haunting question remains as a new millennium beckons. How will the history of God in human consciousness continue to unfold? For those who have faith, God is universal and unchanging. It is the story of humankind's understanding of God that has changed over time and is indeed still continuing to unfold.
I think what attracted me to the early history of Christianity are the parallels with the present time, in the sense that there were so many possible options, so many competing points of view, and the coming together, the merging together of different cultures. The beginning of a new religious movement. You see confusion and excitement too, and a great deal of controversy about what it may mean or not mean, and people attacking it and people approaching it in many different ways, just as they are now, either saying, well, this movement is basically all over, or it's just beginning.
I can't change. I need Jesus to change them.
It often seems as if God today is caught, as if in a freeze frame, between fundamentalism and atheism, and science, technology, and materialism.
How are we worshiping? Are we keeping to what the surrender and the submission of the will are? One side. On the other side, it has looked like, are we being compassionate and merciful? Are we standing up for what is right and forbidding what is wrong? Whether that makes one a fundamentalist depends upon who's looking at it. For those who have been in the West for a long time, it's uncomfortable standing up for right and forbidding what is wrong, because the West has proven its power, but you still have the Quran sitting there saying, but I am the most powerful. So it's a kind of tension between worlds.
So we build walls around us, we put big boundaries between us and others, we form God versus Satan, Christ versus Antichrist, we versus they, and portray them in the most negative terms. And I can understand the psychology of that, because the Bible and the Christian faith is full of paradox. God made human, God of terror, God of love, God of revelation, and God of mystery, God eclipsed and hidden, and God made patent.
When people fix God, when people believe they own the tradition, when they believe that it can be in their absolute categories and nothing else, then they have domesticated God and turned God into idol. Then I think along comes atheism and shatters that complacency, shatters the arrogance, shatters the claim of absolute, and plays a very creative religious role. It challenges us to again see the God beyond the limits, to see deeper.
I was brought up to think that these religious questions would all die off as soon as we knew more about science and, technology. And on the contrary, I think we've come to the recognition that there are limits to what we can learn within the constraints of scientific paradigms, which is enormous and wonderful. I happen to love them. But they don't answer the questions about meaning and about ultimate meaning.
I think the shirk of today, which is associating deities, false deities with God, is represented in absolute materialism. I think the most important God, small g, in America is the dollar. That makes everything, every wrong can be right and every right can be wrong. So you dedicate yourself to the dollar, you are okay.
We can shield ourselves in a number of ways in our modern America from encounter with the absolute. Take, for example, our attitude toward death. In every respect, we try and hide it, and hide from it. We cover our corpses with cosmetics. We prefer the coffins shut, and we get them out of the way, preferably as quickly as possible. But we don't look at the dying face or the dead face. I remember looking at a skull in the ossuary of the Russian monastery Mount Athos, and on the skull was drawn the inscription, "O pilgrim, look well, because I was once as you are, and you will be as I am."
Having looked back at God's history, what can be said of tomorrow? Will humanity's quest for God take new form, yet unknown, in the future?
We're living in one of those axial ages, I believe, in which people really go through major metamorphosis of understanding, both of God and reality. This is an age of human power. Tremendous technological breakthroughs making this world more interesting, and therefore it's a more worldly time. This is interpreted by many as kind of the arrival of secularity. God is irrelevant, we don't need God, or we don't see God, we don't experience God. I believe this is, in fact, the age of human power and freedom, which God has always dreamt of. God's old dream, that people would worship God not out of fear, inadequacy, but out of adequacy, as a dignified creature, equal, unique, of value.
God is acting in history, not only today, yesterday, and tomorrow. God is a factor that does not go through eclipse. He does not take time off. We are living on the mercy of God. No matter how difficult situations are, there must be trials. It looks difficult and hard. But as a believer in God, and I believe that there is always a divine interference, not in a supernatural way, but to enhance the natural goodness that He created. The equation can tilt towards the good side, and I hope that we are going in that direction.
We usually hear about God when we're about 5 years old. Bible stories are told us. But a lot of people never have the opportunity really to revise these traditions. And I think this is important because our ideas of God do grow and change over time. For years I thought I'd completely finished with God. But then I began to look into other religious traditions. I became aware that monotheism was far richer than I'd imagined. We are human beings. We can only experience the divine in a human context as men and women. And so God is in a sense inseparable from our human nature. But also, you can't think of human nature without God. God is a part of our humanity. A sense of the divine is not something that we can just see out there as though it was absolutely self-evident, like a tree or a bus or even the atom. We have to cultivate a sense of God and work on it using our imagination, learning to look through the crust of material things to see the hidden sacred reality within.
According to an ancient teaching, each human act may be seen as a reflection of the divine, a sacred encounter. Lying somewhere within beliefs as they have been may be clues to a new expression of faith for the future, the next chapter in the history of God.